few years ago, I spent hours manually retouching and compositing this image in Photoshop. Recently, I decided to see what AI would do with the same project. So I gave it my original source files and asked it to build the same composite. And it's close, but it's also wrong in ways that actually matter, and I'll show you exactly where later in this video. I have wondered recently whether the Photoshop skills I've built up over many years are soon to become redundant in an AI-driven world. Well, not yet, and not for the work that truly matters to me. More useful than picking AI apart is that the Photoshop skills that were used in this image are still relevant and still useful, and AI can't touch that. I'm going to walk you through the Photoshop techniques I use most often, and all of them were used on this image. So I'll take you through the finished layered composite first, and then we'll rebuild the image from scratch with the two original source images. So if we have a look at the top layer, that is simply covering the front of the can, and we can view that layer independently. It's simply an area that covers the front of the can, and it has its own layer mask. If I switch that layer mask off, you can see it's just the background image duplicated to the top of the layer stack with a layer mask. The layer below that is actually a shadow layer. If we view that layer separately and we turn off the layer mask, it's simply a layer of black, and with the shadow mask it creates a shadow on top of the can, and when you have the bush area in front, that shadow, which I can switch on and off, just makes it look a little bit more in the environment. And then if I switch on the background layer, it all sort of comes together. So let's rebuild this from scratch. And to do that, I'm going to delete the shadow layer, and I'm going to delete the top layer which is covering the can, and I'll also delete the layer mask for the can. So if we have a look at the original capture of this can, you can see it's photographed with the final composite in mind, and doing that really helps it drop convincingly into the final shot. So it's shot in similar lighting, overcast on a similar sort of a day, shot outside. I've used a card behind it just to enable easy separation from the background. It's also shot in the same crop as the original capture. So all of these things help it line up in the final composite convincingly, and it also makes your retouching job just so much easier. So there are many ways I could clear cut this can, and in fact when I originally did this image I would have used fairly manual methods like paths and selections. However, the automatic selection tools are so good these days, I think that's the best way to start. So the one I'm going to use is in the select menu, and it simply is select subject. This subject has pretty good separation from the background, so it does a pretty good job straight off. So once this selection is made, I could go straight to the add layer mask icon in the layers palette and add a mask like that. However, my preferred method is to go to the select menu, down to select and mask, and this just gives you a range of options which are often very useful. So the first one is you can feather the edge, which in this case we probably won't do because it's a pretty hard edge anyway, and it looks reasonably natural. One thing that is quite handy in this, if we shift the edge, which is something else which is quite handy, you can find if you're getting a bit of fringing around the edge, it's picking up a little bit of the background, you can pull that edge in. So just shifting the edge to cut a bit more of the can off. The other thing that's quite useful in this dialog box is decontaminate colors. You'll notice if we zoom in, there's a bit of a blue fringe on the edge of that mask at the moment. If you decontaminate colors, it takes that color of the background out from the edge. However, in this case, I think I'll just zero all of these because it's a pretty clean, clear cut as it is. And I want to keep that can edge reasonably sharp. So in the options down the bottom, I'm going to output to layer mask, so it converts that selection straight into a layer mask, and there it is done. Next, I need to position the can where I want it and just make sure it's the right size. So the easiest way to do that is to reduce the transparency of that can layer, and I can do that by hitting the number 5 key. That takes it to 50% transparency. In fact, any of the number keys such as 2 will take it to 20%, and 0 actually takes it back to 100%. So now that that's at 50%, I can see where I need it to line up, which is just over the front of the waterfall. And if I needed to resize the can, I'd use the free transform tool, and by holding down the shift key and dragging from any of the corners, I can resize the can. But there's one more handy tip. If you hold down the Option key on a Mac or Alt on a PC and click in the area you want to resize from, which is the waterfall area, now when I click and drag with the Shift key and the Option or Alt key held down, it will resize from that area. So if I needed to resize the can, that's the best way to do it. Let's go back to 100%. The next step is to duplicate a selection of this bush that covers the front of the can and makes it look as though it's sitting behind the waterfall. So to do that, I use the rectangular selection, drag a area that covers the front of the can, duplicate the background layer and move that to the top of the layer stack. And now with this rectangular selection active, if I hit the Add Layer Mask, that adds a layer over the front of the can, which is hiding the can. And now all I need to do is touch out this area in front of the can so it looks as though the bush is coming down naturally over the front of the can. So now to remove the front of this bush area that's covering the front of the can. And there are many ways you could accomplish this in Photoshop, and I'm going to show you the most effective techniques that I've worked with. So to start with, I'm going to use the Quick Selection tool. This is a really good way to get a selection started. So using a reasonable size brush, I'm going to click and drag over that bush area that I want to cover the front of the can. And just by clicking and dragging, I can add to the selection based on what I'm clicking below. I can hold down the Option key and subtract from that selection. So I'm making a pretty good approximation of that bush edge to start with. And just moving my way around. If you find that the selection spreads too far, just use the undo. If you find that the selection actually goes too far, just use Command Z or Control Z to undo that last selection. So now I've got a reasonable starting point. I'm going to use the Lasso tool and hold down the Shift key and add to that selection so that I'm covering that whole bottom area. And now I actually need to invert this selection so that when I fill this area with black, it fills the correct area. And there's my starting point. And now I just need to clean up this mask so it's a bit more convincing. So now I want to try and make the mask just a little bit more convincing around the bush areas, because if we turn on the background layer and have a look at some of those bush areas, the bush is quite random, sharp in places and then soft in others, and almost a little bit semi-transparent in places. But our mask at the moment is not that convincing. I need to adjust the mask by using the brush tool. And the way the brush tool works when the mask is active is if I paint with white, it adds to the visibility of the layer, and if I paint with black, that removes the layer. So by selecting a soft edge small brush, I can kind of randomize the selection. The other thing I can do is hit the number key 5 to do it at a 50% transparency, or in fact any level of transparency. If I just want to soften that edge a little bit and make it a little bit transparent, I can do that. Another good technique I find is to alter the actual brush. So if I right click while the brush is active, I can go down and select a different brush. In this case, I want to choose a brush that's got kind of a rough edge. Let's say this drawing box brush. And that gives me a brush which creates kind of a random edge. And although that random edge is a little bit too sharp, I can soften that edge by activating the blur tool and just blurring the edge so that it's a little bit more convincing, not quite as sharp. So I'll actually speed up through this next bit because it's mainly going backs and forwards until I get a convincing edge. Next, I'm going to remove this area so the waterfall looks as though it's coming out of the mouth of the can. And I'm going to use the lasso tool for that, just to start with a rough initial selection that I can fill with black to hide the mask area, and then clean it up with a brush once I've done this. So I'm happy with that at the moment and ready to move on to the next stage, which is adding the shadow. So at the moment it's lacking a bit of realism because I would expect a subtle shadow just in front of the can. So I'm going to create a shadow layer just above the can. And to do that, I add a layer, use the rectangular marquee tool to cover the area I want the shadow to be in, fill that area with black, then go down to the Add Layer Mask icon, and if I hold down the Option or Alt key on a PC, click that, that creates a black layer mask which makes that layer, that black shadow layer, invisible. And when I use a soft edge brush and paint with white as the foreground color, you'll see that layer becomes visible. So the way I do this is use a very low opacity brush, say 2%, and constantly adjust the softness and the size of the brush, and just moving around, adding a bit of shadow until I'm happy with how it looks. And the reason I use a solid black layer and a layer mask is that I can go backs and forwards. So for example, if I find I've gone too far, I can simply hit the X key, which reverses the foreground and background colors. So now black's on top. So that will eliminate that will hide the shadow layer if I paint with black, and if I paint with white, it paints it back in. So that's okay for our initial shadow layer. I may come back to that and tweak that after leaving it for a while and reevaluating it. Even if I did like the image AI produced, it's very difficult to fine tune it because I can only use text prompts. It's not saved as a layered file, so it's difficult to adjust individual elements. The biggest issue I have with AI is I know exactly what I want, but it's difficult to stop AI adding its own unwanted flourishes, like this moss that shouldn't really be there, or this water that's coming from nowhere. Trying to get it back on track by being more descriptive in the text prompt just generates more elaborate and unconvincing variations. And some of the compositing is just not convincing or believable. I think if you know what you want, and in this case I did, it can be hard to make AI generate exactly what you need in a form that lets you easily tweak things or make changes down the track. Whereas with my layered Photoshop file, I can make it as complex as I need by adding as many layers as I need. And I haven't even gone into text layers, adjustment layers, smart layers, other sorts of special purpose layers. A layered Photoshop file is the ultimate in flexibility. I found this particularly useful when working as a professional retoucher, and clients inevitably want to make changes now or a lot further down the track. AI has already taken over things like object removal and initial clear cutting or selection, and I use it all the time in my own work. But for anything that requires editing down the track, or particularly non-destructive editing where I want to resize images and experiment with things, I'm not ready to hand that over, not yet. Let me know in the comments your experience of AI and where you see it fitting in with your workflows. And by the way, if you want one-on-one tuition in any of these sort of skills or anything landscape photography in general, see the link in the description for a few spaces I'm opening up for one-on-one tuition. Also, leave a thumbs up if you did like this video and subscribe to be alerted for future episodes. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.